they tell us that there is nothing to fear. It feels, they report, just so natural that it's only in retrospect that they realize that something unusual was happening. And so it feels as natural as walking into the next room. So in that sense, yeah, nothing to fear.
Nothing to fear.
I think the other thing, to maybe be a little bit more concrete about, how to be quote unquote more loving. NDEers, if they experienced a life review where they reviewed, re-experienced, typically every moment of their life, what they and experienced being on the receiving end of their actions, is they realize that every interaction matters, and that it's recorded somehow, and that they, even in the presence of this all-knowing, all-loving, usually it's in the form of this light that's actually a being, people still in the life review, in those moments where they behaved in unloving ways, feel profound remorse because they experience being the one who was hurt by their own actions. And so that affects people afterwards. They realize moment to moment that the way that they're relating to the other person, it's always a choice about being relatively more or less loving. And so I would say that personally, that's a factor that's affected me a lot, where I realize in moments when I'm about to open my mouth and say something unkind, that at least some of the time I catch myself and sometimes choose to behave in a more loving way. And I certainly am not consistent in that way, but I'm certainly more mindful. Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's a good lesson. Try to be nice to each other, people, because we may have to review our actions eventually, and it might be hard to look at if we were a difficult person or a bad person. Well, okay, let's get to some of these questions then. Here we go. By the way, if you would like to call in with a question, the number is 888-919-2355. That's 888-919-2355. Question number one. Dr. Holden, have you ever talked to people that have had heart bypass? A friend said that they left their body and came back after their surgery, heart bypass surgery. Is this something that happens to people with heart surgery specifically?
Yes, that's one of the conditions in which cardiac arrest is medically induced. And whether it happens spontaneously on its own, or if it's induced there, or if a person is having like a pacemaker implanted, they have to stop the heart to make sure the pacemaker is functioning correctly. And people have reported near-death experiences in all of those heart bypass, pacemaker implantation, and that sort of thing.
Okay. Here's another question. What is the closest clinical biological term associated with NDE? Is there anything out there in biological or scientific terms or medical journals associated with NDE? Or does the medical world just not accept this?
Well, it depends on who in the medical world you're talking to. Bruce Grayson is a psychiatrist. He's a medical doctor specializing in psychiatry, and NDEs have been his focus of research these many years. A really interesting case that people can see on the internet is that of Eben Alexander, and he was on Harvard Medical School faculty for, I think, 17 years, a neurosurgeon. And for those many years, he was a materialist, a reductionist. He thought that the brain produced consciousness. And then one day he got bacterial meningitis. he went into a coma, was in a coma for a little over a week. And during the coma, and they absolutely did not expect him to survive. During the coma, he had, I think, 3 near-death experiences. And he now says he gave a talk at the International Association for Near-Death Studies conference, which, by the way, is held Labor Day weekend every year. This year it's going to be in Arizona. And last year, when in North Carolina, he spoke, and the name of his talk was Childhood's End, because as a result of his near-death experiences, he now believes that the way that he used to look at consciousness being the product of the brain was a kind of childhood from which he is in the process of growing up. So, some medical doctors are very on board with near-death experiences and researching them and so forth. And there also are some medical people who are still in the materialist, reductionist kind of mindset. And an example is Kevin Nelson, who's a neurologist, and he's recently written a book, The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, and he is completely of the opinion that these experiences can be explained. Interestingly, in his book, he doesn't address the criticisms that have been made of his argument and cases of veridical perception and so forth, which defy that argument. But he's just an example of that some medical people have the materialist perspective, but some have the dualist perspective that brain and consciousness are separate, but of course closely interacting when we're alive.
Well, yeah, I imagine it's one of those experiences that it's really hard for us raised in this culture, Western culture, to believe in. You know, I was raised in a culture of science and nuts and bolts, and anything kind of hinting of fortune tellers or seeing the other side or you know, people coming back from the dead. It was you know, it's labeled supernatural or paranormal, and it's usually in the back corner of Barnes and Noble in the bookstore. You know, it's not in the medical journals or anthropology. Maybe some cultures in anthropology journals, but you know what I mean. As a culture, you won't have your medical doctor talking about NDEs. So yeah, it's very interesting. Do you think it's becoming more acceptable to discuss now? Are people more open to it now, NDEs, in the medical world or scientific world?
Yeah, I think it is. The phenomenon is becoming more known and understood as at least something that a lot of people do have experienced, and that it does have undeniable effects on people, and in that way it's, you know, at least in those ways it's very real. And still there are cases, I just interviewed a gal at my university who was in a car accident in which she had a brief out-of-body experience, and when she tried to tell various physicians about it afterwards, they all seemed to look at her kind of frowning a little bit and said, you know, if she needed a referral to a counselor, they could help her. And she didn't. She was just trying to do a little reality check, you know, about have you ever heard of anything like this? And so consequently, when she stumbled across my work at the University of North Texas, she was very relieved to learn that a lot of people shared similar kinds of experiences, and she said it's been very helpful just to know that. And I think that that's probably the single most helpful thing that healthcare providers can do if someone discloses a near-death experience is just to convey that the person is by far not alone, and that a lot of people have experienced this. Literally thousands of people have experienced it, and that if they do want more information or whatever, that they can be referred to place. It's not a place, but organizations like the International Association for Near-Death Studies to learn more about the phenomenon and be able to talk with other people who've had this kind of experience.
There's an International Association of Near-Death Studies.
Yes.
I didn't know that. Do they have a website?
It's www.IANDS for International Association Near-Death Studies.org.
Wow.
And in fact, on that website, if you go there and then click on the Education tab, you can see an online continuing education program about near-death experiences. So if you haven't had enough listening to this for an hour, you can go and see that for another hour and a quarter and hear many near-death experiencers talking about the different phases of the experience, like going into the light. You can hear, I think, 3 different near-death experiencers say in their own words what that was like.
Oh, wow, that is great. I do have a feeling, actually, that 1 hour or even an hour and a half that we have with you now is really not enough to cover. Was it 25 or 30 years of research?
Yes, 30.
So 30. So that's a lot to kind of crack open in an hour.
Yeah.
I do have another question coming in. One person writes, I have no fear of death. What does that mean? Am I missing something?
Well, all I can say is that according to near-death experiencers, they'll just say, amen to that.
Right, well, very good. Have no fear. We shouldn't fear death. I recently took off, went traveling. I did 3 months in India and Nepal. And I experienced some Tibetan Buddhist culture while I was there. And this is a belief system that encourages much contemplation of death. In fact, spends a lot of time preparing for death, and they're totally okay with death. They see death as a transition into another phase and to reincarnate into your next life and improve yourself. And it's funny, those people really don't have this anxiety and fear of death that we have. They have a well-being about them that's pretty amazing. Have you delved into Tibetan Buddhism at all, or any other belief system that seems more in touch with the NDEs?
A little bit, and I'm certainly familiar with Tibetan Buddhism. I've read works by the Dalai Lama, and I do think that there is a lot of consonance between a Tibetan view and what near-death research shows. In fact, I've been invited to Hong Kong to do a public address by the Dujam Buddhist Association there. Wow. That'll be in August. And I'll be talking about the role of near-death experiences, deathbed visions, and after-death communication in grief and grief counseling. But we also are going to have do a taped discussion of Tibetan views and how they compare to near-death research, and then do they're going to do an interview of me as well, just to get kind of like what we've been doing. So we'll have a lot of different exchanges, and I'm really looking forward to that.
It's interesting talking. That is great, by the way, that you're going to Hong Kong, and it just sounds like that'll be a fun experience. All expenses paid? Are they taking good care of you?
Pardon me?
Well, are they paying for the trip?
Yes, it's an all-expenses paid trip, and it was very synchronistic because I have a former student who got her doctorate in our counseling program, and actually I had gone to visit her in Hong Kong once before, and she had just emailed me, and that was back in '97, I believe, and she emailed me and said, I miss you, and I wish you could come and we could go travel for a week together again. And she said, I'm going to see if I can figure out a way to create a workshop that you can come and then you can write off the expenses, as a business kind of thing. Well, before we got very far in planning it, I got this email from this Buddhist association, and I had some communication, just a little bit of communication with them in the past, but they invited me to come and do this public address, and my friend Iris has no association with them whatsoever. But the two things, her email and their invitation, happened about 2 weeks apart. So now I'm going to have all my expenses paid and spend my 3 days with the Buddhists, and then I'll be able to spend time playing with Iris. So it will be really lots of fun.
Interesting. Is this karma coming back to treat you well? Who knows?
I guess.
No. That sounds great. We have another question coming in. Can someone be awake while they are in a phase of an NDE?
Yeah, I'm so glad the person asked that, because that's usually something that I try to say at the beginning, that, of course, the most extreme cases are where people were clinically dead for several minutes, before they were finally resuscitated. But in fact, NDEs occur with people who never lost consciousness. The earliest reports in the professional literature, even before Moody's book, were by an Alps mountain climber named Heim, who had collected stories of people who the nature of their consciousness during falls while they were mountain climbing. And so a person, falls, and that takes just a few seconds, but in the time between the time their feet left one surface and their body landed on another, they had a full-blown near-death experience, something that was far more elaborate than could have happened in just a few seconds in normal consciousness, but occurred just while they were falling. And so they never, and in most cases, these were people who actually never lost consciousness. They might or might not have been seriously injured. And in fact, the person doesn't actually literally have to be close to death. They can just think they're maybe close to death, and they don't even have to think that, because these experiences also occurred in other extreme circumstances, like extreme, profound peace and inner focus of meditation. People sometimes have experiences that are identical to this. And extreme physical exertion, like people who are running a 15K and sometimes report that they have experiences similar to this. So
would these be called out-of-body experiences or OBEs?
When I talk about the material phase of the near-death experience, that in some literature it's called an out-of-body experience. And there too, people have out-of-body experiences in other circumstances, sometimes not even anything extreme. I once interviewed a woman who, as a girl, she was walking across a field with a friend of hers, and she had an out-of-body experience. So now maybe she was extremely happy, and maybe that was a factor, but in any case, people have those experiences a lot of time. Now, Celia Green, who's a physiologist from England, wrote a book called Out of the Body Experiences, and one of the things she observed was that in out-of-body experiences, the person can perceive things that are later shown not to be accurate. And what she found was that the closer the person was to death when they had their out-of-body experience, the more accurate their out-of-body perceptions were. So near-death experiences, those conditions where the person is or believes himself, usually either is or believes himself to be close to death, may be the most characterized by the most accurate out-of-body perceptions.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have another question coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a long one. And then it goes something like this. Dr. Holden, with the majority of modern mainstream or westernized scientists, with the majority of modern mainstream or westernized sciences in medicine being very materialistic, what do you find it will take for metaphysical and transphysical concepts that those who have NDEs and other experiences to become more accepted among the public scientific and medicinal fields? I don't know if you...
Yeah, that's a great question.
It is a great question. It's a long one, but it's a good one.
Yeah. Well,
what will it take for this to become accepted among public scientific and medicinal fields?
I'm not sure. I think there's a great book about scientific revolutions and how people, cultures, actually made shifts in their basic paradigms of how they saw the world, such as when the shift happened between believing the world was flat to accepting that it was round, and believing that from believing that the Earth was the center of the universe to realizing that we revolve, we're one of many planets that revolves around a much bigger planet, much more powerful planet. And in the process, there was a lot of disagreement. There were deaths at the stake, but somehow the evidence just accumulated, and there was a tipping point. And another thing that this author Thomas Kuhn about the nature of scientific revolution says is that one of the things he thinks contributes to the shift is that the people who held the old point of view just die off. And
and a new generation with a new
generation, exactly, comes forward that was not so encumbered by dogma that they couldn't look at the evidence. So I guess that's my assumption, is that if we, and I guess that's kind of my operating belief, that if we keep just putting the evidence out there and keep pointing out the limits of materialist explanations for a lot of these phenomena, that eventually there will be a shift and an acceptance and maybe a culture, a new culture in which these phenomena are not only accepted, but that maybe there are strategies to help people have experiences like this in physically safe ways, that their lives are protected, but help them have an experiential sense of these experiences that I think is a big factor in why people, like Eben Alexander, until he had his NDE, he probably thought that this stuff was a bunch of nonsense. And then he has the experience, and whoa, his whole world is turned upside down, and he comes out transformed. So maybe in the future there will be a world that cultivates these experiences.
It sounds like a better, more spiritual world where we would be more in touch with death and the meaning of our lives.
Yeah.
It sounds like a good thing. Do you see studying NDEs as a good thing then for people to look into?
Yeah, definitely.
Contemplating the big picture.
For example, a few years ago on Iranian television, they did a series on near-death experiences. And I have a former student, Farnoosh Nouri, who is originally Iranian, and so she speaks Farsi, and we acquired these TV programs on DVD, and we began translating them, and it was amazing how these people's experiences were so virtually identical to U.S. near-death experiences. And I can't help but think that if we had the opportunity to really realize that there is an experience like this, that people come away with similar values about loving and learning and treating each other with care and respect between the U.S. and Iran, that it might, help to bring about world peace. But I am not naive enough to think that that's going to happen in our lifetimes. I mean, maybe it will, and something happens that I can't imagine, but maybe eventually.
Well, we can hope. As you say, it takes time for tipping points and global shifts of consciousness. So maybe a new generation will think differently about war and death and our lives here. I want to thank you for your time. This has been an amazing voyage for me into what you study. We have a minute or so before we run out of time. Is there anything you would like to mention? Any projects in the future, or any way people can get in touch with you or read more about what you do?
Well, I have a web page at the University of North Texas website, so if anybody wants to contact me, they can reach me through there.
Okay.
If people want to read more, I recommend Kenneth Ring and Evelyn Valerino's book, Lessons from the Light. And also, I consider that book to be kind of the heart of near-death experiences. And also, my book, The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, which is, I consider, sort of the head of NDEs. And proceeds from sale of the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences goes to the International Association for Near-Death Studies Research Fund. So I don't, get anything personally out of selling the book.
But it goes to a good cause.
It goes to a good cause. And also, if anyone lives in the DFW area, we have a group that meets once a month, and information for that is at the IAN's website as well.
Okay. Well, very good. I believe that's all we have time for this evening. Dr. Holden, it was an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome, and for me just as well, Pat.
All right. Well, then we'll see you next time.
Good.
Thank you, and good luck with everything, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Sounds great.
Okay, thank you. Good night. And everyone who is listening, I just want to remind you that this is Inception Radio Network, Epic Voyages. This is Pat Uskert this evening. Catch us next time, where I believe Nick Redfern will be your host, probably talking about UFOs. And so tune in next time, please. Epic Voyages on Inception Radio Network. Good night, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Please join us again next Monday evening for Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council's Epic Voyages. I'm Roger Peacock for Epic. Until next time.